My father left a note saying not my blood and cut me out of the will. My father died, and the lawyer handed me an envelope thicker than I expected. Inside was a note that said not my blood and then the will that left me nothing. I read it at the kitchen table with my hands shaking. My name was crossed out, and there was an extra line assigning everything to my sister. My dad had always favored her. He taught her to drive and took her on fishing trips while I got weekend chores. That favoritism had always simmered like a bad smell in the house. I brought it up sometimes, and it was brushed off as playing favorites. When I unfolded the note more carefully, there was one line that made my stomach drop. He had written he had a DNA test done, and the results proved I was not his blood. I laughed, because it had to be a sick joke. Then the lawyer slid another envelope across the table marked lab results. The lab sheet had fingerprints and a date. 5 years ago, my dad had a paternity test done, and the lab results said non-paternity. My mother started shaking and said she had no idea why he'd done that. My sister smiled like she'd been handed a prize and thanked the lawyer for thinking of her. I demanded proof. The lawyer handed me scanned emails between my father and the lab, asking for a private test. The emails were formal and precise. My father had paid cash and asked for confidentiality. I texted my mother the date on the lab report and asked where she was then. Her reply was a jumble about visiting her sister and not remembering exact. I check my own memory the way you check a list, when you think you've lost something important. I remembered being at college that month. Finals week, too busy to be anywhere else. That should have made the lab result impossible for him to have my sample. The lab had my name and a chain of custody signature. Things started getting worse when I dug through a shoebox of my mom's old paper receipts she left at my place. There was a hospital receipt with a name I'd never seen and a date 3 months before I was born. I showed it to my mother, and she slammed her hand on the table like she wanted to stop the paper from breathing. She said nothing at first, then admitted to an affair when I was conceived. My mouth went dry. This explained the note, or so my dad must have thought. I wanted the whole truth, not a scrap of someone else's conclusion. So I ordered my own DNA test and sent it to a reputable independent lab with tracking. My sister took a social media victory lap. She posted a photo of the will in a manic caption about justice and family legacy and got a tidal wave of likes. My inbox filled with messages from relatives choosing sides. Some called me by name and asked why I'd betrayed the family. Others sent condolences and quiet support. The house became a war zone. My father had been the sinner, and now his accusation hung over everyone like a stain. A week later, the independent lab emailed my results. My father was my biological dad. I stared at that PDF for a long time. Every part of me felt wronged and relieved at the same time. I printed the report and drove to the law office before anyone could breathe. I slid the printout across the lawyer's polished desk and demanded to speak with his paralegal. The paralegal went pale and admitted the lab my father used was a tiny clinic with poor oversight. They had no CCTV, they accepted cash, and their chain of custody forms matched different handwriting. That was the opening I needed. I hired a lawyer who specialized in contested wills and fraud cases. My sister called me the worst names her friends could think of. She accused me of fabricating the test and trying to steal her inheritance. I scheduled a meeting at the probate court to contest the will on grounds of fraud and undue influence. My lawyer said it would be messy and public and cost more than I had. My mother made me promise not to drag her through it. She said this would kill Dad all over again if we made it public. But the note was already public inside the probate file, and I couldn't live with not proving the truth about my origins. My cousin handed me a stack of old family photos at the courthouse steps. In one, my father stood behind my mother smiling while she wore a dress with a man standing beside her whose face looked familiar once I squinted. I took that stranger's face and compared it to the hospital receipt I had found. The man in the photo looked like the name on the receipt, the neighbor who used to mow our lawn. My father had written not my blood and walked out of the room when I confronted him at the funeral home. He blamed the lab, said he had a right to know, and called me a liar when I showed him my independent result. My mother sat in the pew and didn't look up. She had a paper towel pressed to her mouth and cried like someone trying to stop a flood. The probate judge set a hearing and told us to bring evidence. I brought my independent test, the lab emails, and the hospital receipt with the neighbor's name. My sister brought the cheap private lab report and a notarized letter from my father claiming he acted out of love. He claimed he wanted to protect the family name. That day in the hearing room, the judge looked at the two tests and asked how both could exist. My lawyer pointed out the private lab's chain of custody gaps and cash payment. The judge ordered the private lab to produce raw data, and the technician who handled the sample, they couldn't, because the technician had moved, and the lab's records were messy and incomplete. The judge called it suspicious and left us with a tentative order to freeze the will distribution until the mystery was resolved. That bought me time, but also brought more family hatred. My sister resisted. She started telling relatives that I was greedy and breaking our father's last wish. My dad's health spiraled. He stopped getting out of bed and slept for hours a day, like the whole accusation had worn out his heart. One night, my father called me into his hospital room and asked me to sit. His voice was small, and he said he regretted everything but didn't know how to fix it. I asked him why he'd signed the note and paid for that lab. He said he had always been afraid of being replaced if my mother had ever loved someone else. He told me he had taken the cheap route because he wanted a quick answer. Then he admitted he hadn't read the forms properly and that he'd trusted one lab because they told him what he wanted to hear. I left the room with a pile of contradictions in my hands. Moments later, the hospital called and said he had a stroke. He never woke up again. At the funeral, my sister read a prepared note calling me ungrateful and cruel. She framed the will as her vindication and painted me as the villain who ruined Dad's peace. But the probate judge had already frozen the distribution. The lawyer for the estate demanded both labs' raw data and threatened to subpoena the private clinic. An investigator traced the clinic's cash flows and found a pattern of sketchy tests sold to wealthy men who wanted fast answers. There were emails showing the lab owner ghost-wrote conclusions when clients complained. The court ordered the private lab's report thrown out. That removed the only official paper that said I wasn't his blood. The will stayed frozen while we fought in probate. My sister hired a high-powered lawyer, and we spent months in depositions. My mother finally broke and told the truth in a closed deposition. She said she had an affair years ago, that she loved someone in a rough way, and she begged me not to hate her. I didn't hate her for the affair anymore. I hated that my father used a shady lab and a nasty note to erase me. The judge eventually declared my father's note invalid as a basis for disinheritance because it relied on unreliable evidence. The will was re-examined and the court ordered an equitable distribution to be negotiated. My sister lost more than money in that process. Our family fractured in ways that didn't heal with court orders. I didn't become rich. I got a settlement that covered my legal bills and enough to move out of the house. I moved into a small apartment and changed locks and slept without the weight of a deliberate accusation hanging over my bed. I signed papers with my lawyer and the estate and tried to stop checking the probate docket every morning. My mother called me one night and said she was sorry more times than I'd ever heard her say the word. She asked if I wanted to visit the old house, and I said, not yet, maybe someday. My sister sent one last text demanding I show up to a family Christmas. I didn't reply. I started going to therapy. I talked about what it feels like when a parent turns your existence into a problem. I dated someone eventually. She didn't care about wills or lab reports, and that felt luxurious. Weeks after the courts closed, my phone buzzed with a message from the private lab owner. He apologized and offered a refund for the test fee and a vague condolence about screwing up people's lives. I threw that message away. It felt stupid to accept apologies that came in email form. Now, months later, some family members talk to me again. My mother invites me to Thanksgiving, and my sister shows up with a forced smile and stays in a corner. I haven't forgiven everyone. Some things you can't go back from. My identity wasn't erased by a note. A lab and an angry old man tried to make me into something else, but the papers in a courtroom couldn't change my blood. The hearings left scars and lectures and a stack of bills. They also left one simple fact. I am who I always was. I'm tired in ways that won't fit into a tweet, but I sleep most nights without the fear that my father secretly believed I was a stranger under his roof. I still don't know how to feel about my dad dying the way he did, but at least the truth is out.